Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is the first in what's going to be a series on how to freelance, basically. So how to execute, carry out, how to complete a freelance project from start to finish. So I think it's going to be a 4-part series, and the first 3 parts are going to be all about proposals and contracts. Now, I know that sounds super boring and unexciting, but before you click out of the video, do keep in mind that if you want to work in illustration, and particularly if you want to work as a freelance illustrator, this stuff is absolutely crucial for you to know. And I feel like it's some of the stuff that's taken me the longest to learn, and I am still learning it, and it just hasn't come naturally to me as a creative person. I feel like this is something that has been, all of this has been a lot of hard learned lessons. So I am excited to share it with you, and hopefully it will help make it a little bit easier for you if you're just getting started, or if you're like me and you have continued learning, continued making mistakes throughout your career. I guess we all do that. Then maybe it can help provide some insight there as well. So you're going to need 3 basic elements in both proposal and a contract, and those are timeline and usage terms and the pricing. So those will go into both the proposal that you send to the client before you start working and the contract that you send to the client when you're ready to get started working together and you've already agreed on the groundwork. So since there are a few different elements, today we're just going to zero in and focus on one, and that is the project timeline. At a baseline level, a timeline should answer how long it will take to make this project, the phases that are involved in this project, and a description of what happens at each phase. So the length of time, the steps involved, and the description of those steps. So first off, how to determine overall how long a project will take you. A good place to start is to look at work that you've already done and to try to remember how long that work took you. Ideally, it would be work that's fairly similar to what the client is asking for. So if you're like me and you do food illustration, if I'm requested by a client to do like a really detailed botanical and fruit illustration with flowers and leaves, I want to look and see, okay, what else have I done like that? About how long did that take me? I don't want to look and find like a relatively simple illustration of like a chocolate chip cookie or something like that, something that is one subject, that's one element. The timeline for that illustration isn't really going to give me all that much insight into the timeline for this really complex, detailed botanical illustration. That being said, if you don't have anything in your portfolio that's exactly like what the client is asking you to make, just do your best and be sure you consider every element that went into that illustration. So don't forget to add into the time factor, like how much time you spent researching the subject, whether you took your own reference photos or you got reference photos from online or from a friend or whatever. Take into account that amount of time. Take into account the time it took you to produce the sketch. If you went through a few iterations of the sketch, don't just factor in the time that it took you, like once you started working on the final illustration itself to when that was done. Be sure you include like everything that came before. And also be sure you include the stuff that comes afterwards, like scanning your illustration in and potentially making any changes that you see that are needed after you've scanned it, then editing the image and getting it ready for delivery. All of that should be included in your overall estimate for how long the project will take you. I suggest that you don't quote your project in hours. When you're working in freelance illustration, the best thing to do is to base your pricing off of do what's called a flat fee. So per project rather than per hours. So it can vary obviously depending on the complexity of the project and the usage and all that. And we're going to get into all of that in this series of videos. But as you're putting together your timeline, say if you've estimated, okay, this is gonna, from start to finish, all of those different phases that I just talked about, that's going to take me 8 hours. So if you have the 8 hours, then I recommend adding 30% to that. So what is 30% of 8? So you want to add about another 2.5 hours to that. So that will get you an estimate of 10.5 hours. And if you're really unsure, like if it's the scenario that I just mentioned where the client has asked you for something like really big and detailed and complex, and you don't have anything that's quite exactly like that as a reference point, then you might even want to increase your estimate by a little bit more. And this is going to factor into your pricing, but this is the primary reason that you're doing this is so that you can give the client a sense of how long the project is going to take and what they can expect. So if you end up with that 10.5 hours, that's basically about a day and a half. And that's what you need for your part of the work. So you're going to set that number aside, that day and a half estimate. And before we can put it all together into a timeline, you have to break that estimate down into its component parts and the parts that will also have requirements for the client. So you've probably already gotten a head start on that if you've kind of thought through what are the different phases that went into creating these types of illustrations that I've made in the past. So basically, and again, this is highly dependent on your unique process, but I can tell you what I typically do. And what I typically do is, after all of the groundwork is set, and that's everything that we're talking about in this series of videos here, after all that's said and done, from like the start of the project, so when the contract is received, my first phase, or the signed contract is received, my first phase is always to provide the client with a sketch or sketches, and I send those to the client, and then they send back their revisions and requests for changes, and I make the changes, and I send that back to the client, and they approve it. If they want additional changes, then that costs extra. So that's like one round of revisions, basically. And once I have approval, then I move on to creating the final. I create the final, I send that to the client, and they send me any minor tweaks. So I'm not going to be doing any big revisions at this point. And I've talked about all of this in detail too in another video, which I will link. But yeah, I'm not going to be doing any major revisions at this point. It would be things like adding a highlight, or maybe tweaking tweaking a certain color, or darkening or lightening areas a little bit. But it's really minor stuff. Not going to be like moving anything around or adding entire new elements. So client sends the feedback, and oftentimes at that point the client doesn't even have any changes. They're perfectly happy. So if they do have changes, then I'll make the changes, then present it to the client for approval. And once they approve it, depending on the kind of project it is, they will either pay, and then I will send them the deliverables, whether it's digital or hard copy. Or in some situations, I might do the deliverables first and then the client pays. Okay, so now you have your raw estimate, your 10.5 hours, and you have the basic list of the phases that need to happen. Now you need to put those two things together and add time estimates for the client's pieces, as well as some more description about what's going to happen at each of those phases. So now you want to list out these phases: the sketch, the client feedback, approval, final, client feedback, approval, delivery. Put those in a list in a document, and whether you're using Word or Google Docs or whatever, or write it down in your planner, write it down somewhere, and you want to kind of pair that up with your overall estimate for your time. So if the first day is a sketch, depending on the client's timeline and the type of client that you're working for, if you're working for a magazine with like a really rushed timeline, it is possible that you could be doing a whole project in 24 hours, but generally that's not the case. So let's say your first day is a Monday. You would, let's say it's Monday, January 1st. I don't know when that would happen, but Monday, January 1st, you are going to deliver the sketch. So you put right next to the sketch line, you put Monday, January 1st. Then the client is going to deliver their feedback to you. So you want to make sure, all right, if I'm delivering by the end of day, Monday, January 1st, when do I need to hear back from the client? So then hopefully the client can get back to you by end of day, January 2nd. And again, these are all flexible. If it's a really tight timeline, you could be just allowing the client like 2 hours or something for them to get their revision requests to you. I'm just trying to give an example of what it could look like if it wasn't like a crazy rush timeline. So you deliver the sketch on Monday, the client gets you the feedback on Tuesday, then you might want to allow yourself Wednesday and Thursday to complete the final, or like maybe if we're working with the day and a half timeline, the 10 and a half hours, maybe you only need Wednesday to complete the final, and then you'll deliver that to the client on Wednesday. And then end of day Thursday, they'll hopefully send you their approval or any minor revisions. And then end of day Friday, you should be able to have the final piece ready to go, whether it's the actual physical illustration or a digital deliverable. And I keep saying deliverable. Deliverable is the whatever the end product is. It's the thing that the client is paying for. So it could be a physical illustration, it could be a download, it could be a JPEG or a PNG or all any different file format. It basically covers whatever it is that the client is paying for. So yeah, you can see how once we factor in the client's pieces and what work the client has to do, the timeline kind of immediately expands from what was originally just, we have 10 and a half hours, and now this is a week-long timeline. And as I've said, it could certainly be condensed, but you do have a sense for how a project could fit into a week. And if you're doing a 10 and a half hour project that stretches across a week, you have plenty of room in your schedule to do other projects. But the client doesn't need to know that 10 and a half hours number. That's just for your own planning purposes. The client needs to know, okay, I'm going to get the sketch on this date, and I have to give them my feedback by this date, and I'm going to ultimately have the final by this date. That's the key information for the client. Now, as I mentioned, included in that timeline should be a description of kind of key things that need to happen at each phase in the process. And these include client obligations, pay schedule, and revision schedule. We've already touched on some of this stuff, but I'm just going to drill down a little bit deeper and get more detailed in each of these categories. So for the client obligations, this is another thing that you're going to want to consider and take some time to think through before getting started with the project. So this is something that would go into a proposal, and you don't want to be thinking of this after the fact once you've already started to work with the client. This is something you want ready from the get-go. So some examples of client obligations would be a deposit, a creative brief, or some notes that describe what they want from you, what they want from the end result, what they want you to create, potentially reference photos if the client has specific reference photos, either photos that they would be giving you just like as an example, or even photos that they might want you to work directly from. That's particularly common for editorial clients, at least it is for me. They almost always provide the reference photos. And once you have a list of those things, the things that you're going to need, you want to build it into your proposal to have those things delivered before the start date. So if our start date, our imaginary start date is Monday, January 1st, you probably would have been communicating with client the week leading up to that last week of December. And you want to be sure to be clear with the client that, okay, if I'm going to, once you submit your proposal that has the start date of Monday, January 1st, you have a list of things in there that say, this is what I need from you, the client, to get started on this date. And for the pay schedule, I recommend asking for a deposit. It's always good to ask for a deposit. There are some situations where you won't get a deposit, where the timeline will just be too condensed to get a deposit. Some examples of that would be like if you're doing an editorial project and it has a really tight timeline, you probably are not going to get a deposit for the work before you start. And I'm thinking through here, like if I've ever received a deposit for editorial work, and I don't think I have. Pretty much always I have to just get right going on it and then invoice the client for the full amount later. But if you're working on a larger project or a project with a big budget, or a project that stretches out for a longer period of time, or if you're working with an individual, like even a family member or a friend or a small business, you want to be sure to always ask for a deposit in those situations. And that is because with the big projects that stretch out for a longer period of time, if you don't ask for a deposit, you could potentially be doing a lot of work and spending a lot of time. And it could happen that the client would just say, actually, you know what, we're not going to do this project anymore, and we're going to cancel this project. And you would have gotten paid nothing, and there's nothing you can do about it. But if you build into your agreement that you have, I recommend between a 25% and a 50% non-refundable deposit upfront to get started on the work, then you're at least protected, and then you know that you'll be paid something for your work to get started. And the reason you want to do it, at least I think the reason you want to do it for individuals who who are doing private commissions and maybe potentially even have them pay completely up front, even if it's in phases, like maybe they would pay 50% when you get started and then 50% when you finish the sketch. The reason you want to do it in those instances is because you're a little bit more vulnerable as the artist in that situation, because if you create something for a magazine or for a company and they want to reproduce your work and use it on something that they're selling, they legally cannot do that until they pay you. And if they do it and they don't pay you, you can take legal action. But if it's just, you know, like your friend's mom or somebody that you know from your day job or whatever, and they don't pay you, number one, that's going to be like a really awkward, terrible personal interaction and space that you would have to be in. And number two, there really isn't, like, it's much harder to do something about that, and probably less worth your while as well, since most private commissions aren't going to be as lucrative as larger commercial commissions. So yeah, in that context, you should be thinking of the fee schedule, and the fee schedule should ideally include a deposit of 25 to 50%. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, if it's a longer project, you could potentially ask for payments in installments throughout the project. So something I've done, if it's a project that's going to stretch out more than 4 weeks, is to ask for a 25% deposit up front, then a 25% deposit at sketch delivery, and then a 25% deposit at some other midpoint, like when I finished part of the finals, and then the final 25% at delivery. Obviously, if you're working on a project that's like a week long, it doesn't make sense to have, you know, 4 different deliveries of 4 different payments. So use your judgment there, and just know and understand that there are other ways to do your invoicing than to just have it all for the end. Now, the last piece, the revision schedule, I've already kind of been dipping into this too, because it can be tied to the payment schedule, as you've just heard me mentioning. But the revision schedule is going to be highly dependent on your process and on how you create work, the types of materials you use, the scale that you work at, what else you have going on in your life. So there isn't any one size fits all, but that model that I just laid out of the sketch, client revision, client approval, final, client revision, client approval, delivery, that's a pretty common model, and it could be a good place to start if you're not really sure how to work it out. The bottom line is that you want to be clear with the client what is expected at each phase. So when you offer the sketch, be clear that it's going to be a black and white sketch, or if it's going to be a color sketch, be clear that it'll be color, but it's not going to have shading. Tell them what to expect, that they'll get a sketch and then they'll have revisions. And don't just say revisions, say what kinds of revisions they can ask for. So I let clients do pretty comprehensive revisions at the first phase. So at the sketch phase, they can basically say, they could ask me to do anything. They could ask me to completely rework it from scratch. The only thing that they couldn't say would be to add like major new elements to the illustration. So if the schedule and the fees that we agreed on were for, like, I don't know, drawing 1 loaf of bread, they couldn't come back to me with the revisions and say, actually, can you make this like a huge pile with 20 different kinds of bread? That would require me to like actually go back and renegotiate payment and the schedule and everything. But they could say, oh, you know what? I thought I wanted the bread to be shaped like a baguette, but now I actually think I want it to be shaped more like a regular loaf or something. And I would totally do that. And at the final revision, I only would offer them, I only will accommodate much smaller revisions. So like adding highlights, increasing shadows, those sorts of things that I already mentioned. And a client can always go beyond that, but that will increase the price as well. And that is also something that you should include in your proposal and your contracts, being clear about what it will cost if the client does want to do extra revisions. So I think that is it for this video. So hopefully you feel like you have a good sense of how you can create a timeline. I'm going to leave an example timeline in the description box that you can use and obviously edit and make it fit for your work. In the next installment, we are going to go over usage terms and pricing. So how to actually price a project and come up with a price for it. So that's what's coming next. Hope you guys liked this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do hit the thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment, all that good stuff. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.